So when I was growing up, when I think about growing up, I realize how old, I'm getting, and how much the world has changed. For example, I know that for the most part, and this is not true for today, but my brothers, myself, my sister were often reminded by my parents that there is a difference when we speak to our friends and when we speak to adults, and most especially when we speak to our parents. Today, with no civility left, I think, in the public forum, I can see that the values with which I was brought up pretty much are gone in our contemporary culture. For my parents, it was clear that there was a certain way in which we speak to them and in which has kind of slipped away. So we would hear, who do you think you're speaking to? Would be a thing my parents would tell us. Who do you think you're talking to? Would be a big thing, right? I'm not one of your friends. And sometimes my mother wouldn't even answer, if we spoke in a little snappy way. She'd be ignoring us, and then she finally would say, "Oh, are you talking to me?" With that tone, I thought you were speaking to one of your friends. In my family, we were taught that we were not to be fresh to adults. That was a phrase we learned, the word fresh. I know that the word means other things today, but for us it meant that we spoke to adults in a crass way. Or we talked back, is a phrase, or dismissed an adult. And we were never to show those attitudes at all, any kind of attitude to adults. They were clear that to us, my parents, that they never wanted the Greenleaf family, the Greenleaf boys, especially at school, the children, to be known as fresh children. No matter how crazy we thought adults were, and adults are crazy at times, we admit, right? So we learned that it made a big difference to whom we were speaking and how we spoke. And I have to admit that I prefer that way of growing up, the way I grew up, that we have now than what we have now. But as I said, it kind of shows my age, right? More than anything else, because it's just amazing, And I'm a little sheltered from that because most people, don't use cuss words in my presence, or they really apologize if it slips out. But what's amazing now is you go to the grocery store or something, and parents, swear at their children, and the children swear at their parents, right? And kids swear at each other. You're like, what is happening? And then even on television now today, there are more bleep words, right? An hour would be unheard of that, that political officials would use such language, and even on television. With that, I'd like to ask you, have you ever thought that it might make a difference how you speak to God? Today's gospel refers to two people who pray. And Jesus says one prayer is heard and the other is not heard. In other words, he's saying God doesn't listen to that. My Father in heaven doesn't listen to those kinds of prayers. And I love that little line that might get unnoticed, if you read it really fast. Jesus says, the Pharisees took up his position and spoke this prayer to himself. "Oh God, I thank you." Just because the Pharisees started with the prayer with "Oh God," Jesus says that he spoke this prayer to himself, not to God. Jesus then praises the tax collector who approaches God in all humility, knowing that he is speaking to God. And Jesus says that the tax collector went home justified, not the Pharisee. So how do you speak to God? Sometimes in our prayer, it can be like God serves us, not that we serve God. We tell God how we think things should be in our infinite wisdom and how God should follow what we think is good. The first reading says, though, that the one who serves God, that God will hear, and that the prayer of the humble pierces the clouds, it says. Like the tax collector, We stand before God with open hands to receive anything as a pure gift. In all humility, we bow before God and His majesty, knowing our proper place before God. Today we may think that it's hard to relate to God, that God who is high and mighty, and so prefer to relate to Him on our level, kind of bring Him down and treat Him like one of us. And that may be okay as long as we balance that with never forgetting to whom we are speaking, that He is the Lord and God of all creation, that God of all that exists. Therefore, we always, hopefully, humbly stand before God as one of His creatures and never as His equal, which is hard for us, I think, in our culture because we really value sort of an egalitarian kind of system where everybody's equal. But hopefully this doesn't affect our attitude as we approach God. Now, it doesn't mean that we cower in a corner, shaking in fear, because the message is that God, the God and Father, is the Father of all love, and that He calls us to Himself. But He is still God, and we are not. There is no question today that there's this super lack of reverence, first for our parents and elders, the school system. We hear horror stories in terms of the way students now speak to teachers. The elected officials, when they're on camera, there's more bleeping that happens than I've ever seen before. And other members of society. There's a lack of reverence, a lack of recognizing the sacredness in our midst. And then also, too, the sacredness in our church, especially for us in the Catholic Church. We believe the real presence of Christ is here in every tabernacle, in every Catholic church. Therefore, this is not just one building like any other building. And public discourse is filled with cussing and poor dress and rude speech and more. Jesus praises the tax collector because He says in His prayer, "O God, be merciful to me, a sinner." Have you ever said these words to God in prayer? God, be merciful to me. With a reading like this for this weekend, I don't know about you, but it causes me to reflect on how I pray before God. What is my attitude when I address God, when I speak of God, when I speak to God? Do I really humble myself before God? And if I humble myself before God, what does that look like? You know, just coming back from Poland, recognizing that you go visit John Paul II's home. And one of the things they say is that this is where John Paul II, growing up, saw his father kneeling at his bedside saying his prayers. When was the last time you knelt by your bed or knelt before God in your home and said prayers? The goal of the spiritual life is to be in right relationship with God. That's what we say, right relationship, proper relationship. And in this way, we know our place before Him. In a few minutes, the host will be held up, and I will say the words, "Behold the Lamb of God. Behold Him who takes away the sins of the world. Blessed are those called to the supper of the Lamb." And you and I say, because the book says I have to say it as well, the priest says it along with the people, "Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. I am not worthy for communion, but only say the word and my soul will be healed." Only say it. You can heal my soul and make me worthy. I don't do it myself. Do we all approach the altar to receive the sacred body and blood of Christ humbly, knowing that we are not worthy? But only God makes us worthy, makes us able to receive his Son's presence as a pure gift of his love for us. So maybe, today it's no longer in vogue in our culture to act like gentlemen, act like ladies with humility and grace. But hopefully that's not true in our relationship with God, that we know our place before God. Because Jesus ends this gospel with the one who exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. So it does matter. It does matter when we stand before God to know our place before him. And it is a great place because it is a place rather than no place. And then realize to whom we are speaking when we do pray.